Hey everyone, we're going to start our little experiment here with Deborah Granick's 2010 film Winter's Bone. So, several of the films that we've seen so far fall roughly into the category of independent film, but we haven't really talked about independent film in a contemporary context. And there are a few points that I wanted to sort of raise about what that means so that we have a framework for thinking about it. The main thing that makes a film independent is its financing, that it is independently raised, usually through, external resources. It's not the filmmaker whose money they're throwing into the pot themselves, but they have a group of people who are willing to finance them. And then distribution is either done individually, which has been true in the past, particularly in the 60s and 70s, where independent filmmakers would literally carry their films around from theater to theater, but more often they are bought up by distribution companies. And there are several that you maybe identify if you watch a lot of contemporary independent films. A24 is an example of this. Annapurna is another one, and Roadside Attractions, which is the company that bought Winter's Bone after it won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival in 2010. Another thing that we associate with independent films is a critical reception, that they are praised for, artistic X, fill in the blank, that they tend to sort of buzz around the edges of awards, and certainly that was the case with this movie, where there were Oscar nominations for Best Picture and Best Screenplay, a nom for Jennifer Lawrence for Best Actress, and John Hawke for Best Supporting Actor. But as is often typical for an indie film, it only did modest box office. So, that sort of dichotomy of critical success, box office, meh, which is really just a matter of often a matter, not always, but often a matter of just how much distribution a film gets, whether it gets a wide release or a relatively narrow one. Which leads us to the first discussion question. Is there something about independent films that prevents them from being more successful at the box office? This is the first film that we've seen this semester that is directed by a woman, and I bring that point up not because I think it's essential to understanding something about the film, but it does give us some context for thinking about contemporary cinema generally. The stats on women behind the camera are still, after, more than a century of movie making, absolutely abysmal. 15% of studio films are made by women, directed, I should say, versus around 33% of independent films. There is a slight increase year by year over the last 10 or 15 years, but it's only a slight one. And the reason why independent film has more female representation, of course, is that is where those who are not represented in the mainstream, those who do not have access to the studio system, for example, tend to do their work. Independent film is where the great queer voices of cinema came from, and the great filmmakers of color came from, for example, because they were not able to work their way into the studio system. Female writers tend to skew roughly along the same lines percentage wise from year to year. About 17% of studio films in 2018-19 were written by women, about 32% of indie films. When you look at the relationship between those directed by men and directed by women and written by men and written by women, things get even more stark. If a man directed the film, only about 11% of those films were written by women. If a woman directed the film, about 72%. Now, there's obviously some overlap there because often, not often, but frequently, films are written and directed by the same person. But the starkness of that contrast that we have, on both ends of the spectrum, this kind of gender divide, I think is what's important here, especially in the context of movie consumption. More than half of moviegoers across all platforms, that is, in theaters as well as streaming and DVD, et cetera, are women, and about 40% of those who are buying tickets at the movie theater are. So obviously, there's a skewed representation here. Which leads us to the second discussion question. Why haven't we seen a greater increase in female directors and writers in Hollywood films over recent years? Now, we've talked a little bit about realism as a kind of marker of quality in contemporary film, and one of those things that we associate with relatability and so on and so forth. But in Winter's Bone, I want to focus on something slightly different here, starting with the way the movie was made. This was a film that was shot on location in the Ozarks using some Hollywood actors. The two that I previously named, of course, were relatively known at the time, although not what you'd call A-list actors, certainly not then. But mostly locals who were working out of their actual homes. So a lot of the footage that we're seeing is people acting from where they live. First-time actors, we often call them non-professionals, but the minute that you pay somebody to make a movie, they become a professional. So really that term is not apt. One of the things that is clearly important in Granick's work is establishing a sort of empathetic relationship with the characters, that they become, again, relatable to us within their circumstances, which creates a little bit of a dissonance, since this is a movie, which is often true of independent films, that was consumed primarily by a middle-class, well-educated audience. That's the demo for most independent film. And yet it's representing a population that often, is disparaged as quote unquote poor white trash. So how do you establish that relationship? And the direction that Granick goes in this movie is to focus on characterization, which is to say, making the characters' situations and making their character traits likable or relatable in one way or another, and then presenting them with believable obstacles. In other words, the things that happen in their story seem almost inevitable. There's nothing that comes out of left field. There's no soap operatic sort of elements to it at all. And this creates a kind of rapport between the viewer and the characters, and of course draws us into their situation. So the next discussion question, I'm asking you to pick a character, and what one strength or weakness do you believe makes us feel either empathy or pity for them? This is a movie that is about family, it's about community, it's about connection, the things that connect us historically, the things that maybe make us feel disconnected at times as well. And we see this particularly represented in Ree as a character within her own family and within her own world. She's obviously not only the center of the story, but she's kind of the moral guide or the compass point from which we see how people relate to each other. And we see this particularly expressed in the way in which she confronts her Uncle Teardrop and demands something of him, a kind of sacrifice in a sense, to put himself on the line so that she can protect her family. Um, but we see, I think, even more clearly in her relationship with her siblings, since that is her kind of moral responsibility. That's the weight that she's carrying in this story. Um, she is frustrated when they feel beaten down and unsupported in their community, and sort of holds that community to a certain moral code. She says you should never have to ask for what ought to be offered, for example. And at the very end of the film, when her brother Sonny is asking whether she intends to leave, since there's obviously this suggestion throughout the story that she's going to join the military and hopefully find, marshal some resources out of that experience, get some money, see the world, get some skills, etc., etc. She says, I'd be lost without the weight of the two of you on my back. And that word weight here, of course, is very important, right? That she's associating them directly with a burden. And it's obviously one that she willingly carries, but there's no question that that's what it is. So when we sort of zoom back from this movie and look at the things that it's saying about family and community and the things that we owe each other and the things that we can expect from each other and the things that we can't expect from each other, there's a really interesting politics at the center of it. There's nothing sentimental about it. It's about doing what one must do to survive, but also to protect those who are important to one. Which leads to the next discussion question. What is Ree's status in the community? And what do you think her future is there? Finally, I want to talk about how this movie focuses on the notion of doing the unthinkable, which is to say, going beyond the boundaries of not only normal behavior, but what you would think that you were capable of doing. We have in the family here, in Ree and her two siblings and her mother, who's obviously suffering with some psychological issues, we have characters who are under extreme duress, who are being forced to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise take. And we see this kind of first in the movie when they're hunting for squirrels because they've run out of food, and Sonny asks Ree, "Do we eat the guts?" basically, and she responds, "Not yet." And the assumption there, of course, is that things are bad, but they haven't gotten as bad as they're going to get. At the very near the end of the film, of course, Ree is forced to do one of the most unthinkable things one can imagine, which is cut the hands off of her father's corpse. And there are two things going on here that I think are really interesting. One is this kind of going further than you could have imagined that you ever could in order to survive and to protect the people that you care about. But there's also the kind of, what is the value that others will get out of these hands, that the police want from them? Are they simply evidence, or are they a payment in flesh of some kind, right? That it isn't enough simply to prove that someone is dead, that you need to bring part of their body forth. It's almost like a sacrifice to the system or something like that. And Ree often, at least in my reading of the film, feels that way about the world around her, that things are not only being demanded at a kind of economic level and a social level, but there's a sort of sinister force at work, which brings us to, at least for me, the title of the movie, this notion of winter's bone, not simply of the bones in the hands or the bones of the body, but this kind of rending of the flesh, this destruction of the individual. And maybe I guess not the clearest picture, but the biggest picture of this is the relationship between home and family in this movie. Is family something that you sacrifice home for? Do you have to make a choice between the two of those things? Can you have one without the other? Rhea is kind of doing this math, I guess, in her head throughout the course of the story. What does it mean to protect herself and the people that she is tasked with caring for? She loves also, but is tasked with caring for. Which leads us to the last discussion question and the end of this presentation. What would you say is the greatest cost Ree paid over the course of the film? What did she lose or have to give up to keep her siblings and her mother safe?